In the book of Job that we've been going through, we've looked at this outline every week, so here'll be the last time that we look at it in this study, that the book of Job divides itself into these three sections. The prologue, which set the stage of Job as this righteous, godly man who now is suffering, who's being mistreated, who feels like he's being mistreated because Satan has taken everything away from him with God's permission. Then you have the dialogue in 3 through 42:6. It begins with these speeches in this exchange between Job and his friends. Then in 32 we have another man introduced, Elihu. And then finally you have the epilogue in 42 through the remainder of the chapter. Now when we come into chapter 38, we're dealing now with the Lord speaking. Job finally gets what he's been asking for, but it doesn't quite go the way Job had anticipated it going. You may remember that throughout the book of Job, that Job had asked, if I could just have the opportunity, to talk to the Lord, if I could just have the opportunity to plead my case, then he would respond and he'd see things from my point of view. Job 13:22, then call and I will answer, or let me speak and you respond to me. Job said, let me tell my story and then you respond back to me. And then later on in Job 31 and 35, oh, that I had one to hear. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. So Job has been saying, I want to speak to God. I want to present my case, and then God can respond to me. Well, the Lord finally speaks here in chapter 38. But as he answers Job out of the whirlwind, probably to demonstrate his power, he tells Job, I'm going to do the talking. You listen to me. In fact, what he says in the very first part of his speech, he begins by saying, who is this who darkens my counsel, my words without knowledge? Who is it here that is questioning me and my moral government of the world? Who is it that dares speak words they don't understand? Now, Job, gird up your loins. The New King James translates that as prepare yourself like a man. And what God is telling him is, Job, I'm going to interrogate you, not the other way around. I'm going to talk to you, and then after that, if you want to answer, you'll answer, but I'm going to speak first. So God begins by saying, prepare yourself. Now, if this is the first time you were studying through the book of Job, and I doubt there's anybody here that describes this morning, you're probably going to realize that the speech is probably not what you anticipate. If you're studying through the book of Job for the first time, and God finally says, okay, I'm going to talk to you, Job, you might have expected the Lord to go back to the events of chapter 1 and chapter 2 and explain to Job why he underwent all the suffering. But he doesn't. Satan isn't introduced. He doesn't explain to him why that Satan came into his presence and challenged him and I had to prove that I was worthy of service. God doesn't do any of that. In fact, Job never really, so far as we know, understood the background to his suffering. He didn't know, he didn't understand. And that's really part of the value of the book for you and I today, because we don't always understand either. And God speaks to him about his greatness and his sovereignty in creation. In fact, in commenting on this section of verses, Francis Anderson, in his commentary on the book of Job, said that Job is not called to a flight of pure thought into the transcendent beyond. He's not called to plunge into the depths of his own beings to find ground of it all. It is by looking at the common things with God that Job is able to exclaim in the end, now I'm satisfied, I have seen you with my own eyes. This is more than enough to answer his questions, or rather, it liberates him to live with joy even when the questions are not answered. And I think that's right. In other words, his understanding doesn't answer all the questions, but it allows him to live in spite of the fact that he doesn't have all of the answers. So he goes through this section talking about God and creation. And we really have this divided into two sections. His power as seen in the earth in creation, and then when it is seen in the animal kingdom. Here in 4 through 38, he asks Job a series of questions. that are designed really to emphasize his power and man's insignificance in comparison to that. So, for example, Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me, where were you? In other words, I had the power that I laid and I created this world. I spoke it into. Where were you when that? Tell me, surely you understand. And I think what God is saying, it really in a very pointed way to Job, tell me, surely you know that because you're questioning me and what I'm doing. So surely you must have some knowledge of that. In fact, look what he said in verse 5. Who determined its measurement? Surely you know. And there is in the Lord's, I think, response to Job, a great deal of sarcasm in him. Surely you know that because you've dared to darken my counsel and to question me. Who stretched the line upon it? What are the foundations fastened to? Who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and the sons of God shouted for joy. In other words, Job, you didn't create this world, I did. I spoke it into existence. Who created the sea in 8-11? Who was it that shut the sea with its doors? In other words, who was it that when they created the sea in verse 10, fixed its limits and said, okay, here's where the sea stops and it goes no further than this. Here's the end of the ocean or here's the end of the sea and this is its limits. Job, did you do that? Because the point is I did that. I created all of that and I put it. Can you control the day in 12-15? Have you commanded the morning since your days began? You ever got up in the morning, Job, and said, you know what? I want the sun to shine. And so I'll just cause it to be day. Maybe it gets late at night and you have work to do. And you say, you know what? I've got this. I'll just command it what? I'll just command it to be day. Of course, the point is, and no, I can't do that. I've never done that. You know who can do that? God can do that. In verse 16-18, have you entered into the springs of the sea? Have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of hell of death been revealed to you? Have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the breadth and the earth? Look at verse 18. You can highlight this. Tell me if you know all this. So we're like, go ahead. You understand all that? Go ahead and tell me. Because I do. Then, do you know the paths of light? In 19-20, where is the way of the dwelling of light and darkness? Where is its place? That you may take it to its territory and that you may know the paths of its home. Do you know the paths of light? Do you control it? Because you were born then, surely, in verse 21, or because the number of your days is great. Surely you've been around long enough. You understand all of that, Job, right? I almost picture Job, and you see this in the response. You know, Job, who probably thought, all right, here's my opportunity, and I just see in my mind Job shrinking, little by little, as God is speaking to him, getting him to see that in comparison to me, Job, what? You're nothing. You are insignificant. You are unworthy. And we'll see that's what Job's response is. The reason I use those words, that's what Job says here a little bit later. Can you cause the rain in 25-30? Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water or the path of the thunderbolt? To cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, and the wilderness in which there's no man. In other words, out in the middle where nobody lives, God causes what? Rain. He's the one behind it. Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? The point is, I control all that. You don't. What about the constellations? He mentions a number of them in 31-32. Did you put them in their place? Do you have dominion over that? Can you command the clouds to rain in 34-38 and send out lightning? No, man doesn't have that ability. You know, it's interesting. With all the advances man has made in science and inventions, you know one thing we still can do? A lot of things we still can do. But we can't decide in the midst of a drought what? I'm going to go make it rain. Or when we've had a lot of rain, we can't say, you know what, I'm not in the mood for a storm today. We're just what? Don't do. The point he's trying to get Job, you can't do that. Guess who can do that? I can do that. That's my power, that I am in control of everything. And so you have here in 4-38 this description of God's power in earth and in creation. Then he turns to talk about his wisdom and power as seen in the animal kingdom. And he goes really one by one. I know we're hitting the highlights of this morning. But he questions, asks a number of questions about different animal groups. And his point is, why do these animals act the way they do? Who provides for them? Who takes care of them? The answer is God does. Matthew chapter 6, in talking about worry, he talked about the birds of the field, that God what? God takes care of them and provides for them. So he talks about the lion, first of all, in 49 through, let's see right here, 39 through 41, he talks about the lion. When he says, can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? Do you provide for them when they're hungry, when they're in their lair? And the answer is what? No, I don't. But God said, I do. I mean, that's the implied answer. Who provides food for the raven when its young ones cry to God and wonder for the lack of food? Do you do that, Job? No, you don't do that. I'm in control of nature is the point. What about the question about the mountain goat and the deer? Do you know when it's time for the mountain goat or the deer to give birth? Can you identify the number of their months? I don't think he's simply here saying that man can't figure out the gestation period of an animal. We can generally sit down and we can in our minds sort of figure out, if you will, that this is how long, this is how long a cow is. Is it 9 months in a cow, approximately, whatever, for the gestation period, or 11 months for a horse? We can talk generally, or whatever it is for a goat or a sheep. But I tell you the one thing, Ross may be able to tell, okay, these goats are going to be born in about this many days. But what he can't do is he can't say, I tell you what, I know exactly the day and the hour. I know exactly when they're going to be born. And we don't know that. Man's not in control. Guess who does know that? God does. He can identify the exact time of the birth of the animals. He put all of that into place. Even the wild donkey, this is not a donkey that is a domesticated donkey he's talking about here in verse 5 through 8, but the wild donkey, the one that has its home in the wilderness and in the barren land. The range of mountains is his pasture, and he searches after everything that is green. Who put that wild donkey there? That's the point. Who loosed its bonds? Who made it wander? The answer is God did. God put it there. Verse 9, what about the wild ox? Just as a side note here, the old King James Version makes a mistake here in their translation. It's a good translation, but they have there in verse 9 unicorn, I believe. Am I correct in that? Is that in verse 9? And so unicorn, of course, a mythical creature. It is some debate as to what this is exactly, but most translations now render it as a wild ox that's being talked about here in that passage. And so if you use the King James, again, a good translation, you might just circle there and write out in the margin of your Bible, probably not a unicorn, but a wild ox of some sort. And the point is that the wild ox, is it going to serve you? Will you be his manager? Will you bind the wild ox in the furrow with ropes and he plow the valleys behind you? The implied answer to that is no. You take a wild animal like that's wild, and you try to what? Make him plow the garden. What's going to happen? He's not going to do it. You may end up hurting the process. In other words, you don't have the kind of power that you can just control that wild ox. Will he trust you because his strength is great, or will you leave your labor to him? Will you trust him to bring home your grain or gather it to your threshing floor? Well, no, I'm not going to trust the wild ox. I can't control that, is Job's answer. But God said, what? I can. Probably another error, not as bad as the unicorn in 13 through 18. I think, again, my memory's been a long time since I've read through this account in the King James. I think it has the word peacock there, and that's better translated as ostrich in that particular passage. And it's sort of interesting. He talks about the ostrich's stupidity, really. What apparently, in fact, there's a saying, I haven't heard it said very much, but a number of commentators alluded to the saying that some people say that he's as stupid as an ostrich. I haven't used it a lot or at all, but apparently they're sort of known for being sort of a bird that seemingly lacks wisdom. That lack of wisdom is seen in the fact that she waves her wings proudly, but when she lays her eggs, she doesn't care for them like other birds do. She doesn't put them in a nest and lay over them, and set on them. She lays her eggs in the ground and then covers them with dust. And the dust or the dirt keeps them warm. But what happens is then somebody comes along and they walk over where those eggs are. What happens? They crush them in verse 15. A wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly as though they were not hers. Her labor is vain without concern. In other words, this is how she treats lays her eggs and cares for them, seemingly like she doesn't care, because God deprived her of wisdom. In other words, why does she act that way? God made her that way. I think that's the point. You ever wonder why that animal acts this way and this one has this? Because why? Who created her with the instinct to bury her eggs and cover them up? God did. And he did not endow her with understanding, but what did he endow her with? In verse 18. Speed. Yet when she lifts herself on high, she can outrun what? She can outrun a horse. What he did give her is the speed, what? To escape and the speed to run. God created. There's the wisdom of God. There's the complexity of the universe really described even throughout all of this section. You think about the horse in 19 to 25. Have you given the horse strength? Have you clothed his neck with thunder? And he goes on and he describes what the horse here is always has been one of the animals that fascinates man. Back in those days, it would have been like having an army full of chariots. Of tanks to have had, horses and chariots. The strength and the speed of a horse. And he describes how the horse devours in the distance with fierceness and rage. How he can cover great distances. And how he's always ready for battle. Who created the horse? Gave it its strength. God did. What about the hawk and the eagle? They make their nest on high in the rocks where seemingly there's nothing what? To provide for them. And yet God gave them the ability from those great heights to what? Spy out below what they need, and then the speed and the swiftness what? To capture. So what God has done really when you come back to this section in 38 through 39, again, if this is your first time reading through the book of Job, you're probably thinking, that's not what I'm expecting. I'm expecting some answer as to why Job is suffering, some explanation as to why he's undergone all of this, and God doesn't do any of that. What God does is God says to Job, let me ask you some questions. Do you have the power to create the world? Did you put the sea in its place? Do you control the weather? Do you control the thunder and the lightning? Do you control all of the animals? Because that's the power that I have. That's the wisdom that I have, that I created all of that. So then he comes in verses 1 and verse 2 of chapter 40 now, and he says, shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? In other words, the conclusion, I think, of all of this in verse 2 is, who is God? How did he refer to himself in verse 2? He is the Almighty. He is the all-powerful. Shall the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? God, this is who I am. Job, you're going to tell me how what? How I should do things? You're going to question my moral government of the world? You're going to tell me that I'm wrong for all that I have done and for what you've undergone, Job? Do you know who you're talking to? I think in essence is what God said. Now, Job, there it is. You wanted to rebuke me? Answer it. Respond to it. Again, I picture by this point in time, Job feels about that high. In fact, let me just say this. Anytime we look at ourselves in comparison to God, we really should come away feeling about that high. When I think about his power, and then I think about me in comparison, I think about his wisdom, and I think about me in comparison, man always comes back feeling pretty small in comparison to the Lord. So Job has his opportunity now to speak. This opportunity he has been waiting for. And he says, behold, I am vile. What does that mean? Yeah. The word vile there, it's not my favorite translation here of this particular passage. I don't think Job is saying, I'm just absolutely wicked and ungodly, and I don't think that's what Job is saying. The LSB in the New American Standard says, I'm insignificant. I think the English Standard Version says I'm a small account. The NLT said I'm unworthy. In other words, the point is that after hearing all of that, Job said, you know what, in comparison to you, I'm pretty what? I'm insignificant. I'm pretty small. God's not just looking at Job. God's controlling the entire world and everything in it. And then he said in verse 4, what shall I answer you? What do you think Job is saying? What do you say to that? How do you respond to that? I tell you what, I'll lay my hand over my mouth. What does that mean? I think I'm going to be silent, okay? Isn't it interesting, by the way, if you were to go back and you see here, and many times Job covers these 2 or 3 chapters, talking about all that he's undergoing, and now he finally gets the opportunity to talk to God, and it covers what? That much in your Bible. I'm vile. I don't know what to say. I'm just going to be quiet. Yes, I have spoken, but I will not answer. Yes, twice, but I will not proceed. And so that's Job's initial response. God's not through with Job yet, though. And that should have a question mark after that first point. But in chapter 40, in verse 6 through 40 and verse 14, he comes back and he said, all right. He answered Job out of the whirlwind again. And he said, prepare yourself like a man. Gird up, get ready. I'm not done with you yet, Job. I'm not done questioning you yet. I will question you and you will answer me. Would you indeed annul my judgment? Would you condemn me that you may be justified? You've called what? What had Job done? He called God into question. I mean, yes, I understand all Job's going through, and we sympathize with him, and I understand why Job was saying some of the things that he did. Was it right, though? I mean, he had questioned the Lord. He had told God, this isn't fair. You're using me for what? You're using me for target practice. At the time it did. And we're going to see Job's going to repent of that here before the book is over with. Have you an arm like God? And can you thunder with a voice like his? Are you strong as the Lord? Is your voice as strong as his? Then adorn yourself with majesty and splendor. Array yourself with glory and beauty. I think part of the point is, Job, since you think you're that great and powerful, why don't you just change things yourself? I mean, obviously, you think you're in a position to question me. If you've got the power of God and the understanding of God, why don't you just adorn yourself with majesty and splendor and array yourself with glory and beauty? You could change things yourself. And then he says, disperse the rage of your wrath and look on everyone who's proud and humble him. Job, why don't you just, maybe there's a reference here to the 3 friends. You've got a problem with the friends. Just humble them, Job. I mean, obviously, since you're questioning me, you've got that kind of, what? Power, don't you? Look on everyone who's proud and bring him low. Tread down the wicked in their place. Hide them in the dust together and bind their faces in hidden darkness. Highlight verse 14. Then I will also confess to you that your own right hand can save you. When you start doing those kind of things, Job, then what? You can take care of yourself. And I'll confess to you. But I think the point is, until you can do that, Job, then what? Quit questioning how I'm ruling in the affairs of men. Quit questioning everything that I'm doing until you can do all of that. Then he talks about 2 examples of his power. I'm not going to go in great detail through all of this section here. There are two creatures that are talked about, the behemoth or the behemoth, both pronunciations are acceptable, but the behemoth and then the leviathan. And there is some debate as to what these creatures are. Let me just give you the description very quickly of the behemoth that is given here in 15 to 24. He has a tail like a cedar in verse 17. his bones are like beams of bronze, and his ribs like bars of iron. That's described this great strength. He is the largest of God's creation. That seems to be the point of verse 19. He's the first of the ways of God. When it comes to the size of the creatures God made, this behemoth, he's what? He's number one. Only he who made him can bring him near his sword. In other words, nobody dare approach this creature. Whatever it is, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Nobody can dare approach this behemoth. The mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. In fact, he's not disturbed. He's confident, and nobody really can capture and bring him under control. And so this is this behemoth that is described here in verses 15 through verse 24. So what is this behemoth? That's the question. Well, a couple of different answers have been given, not just a couple, numerous answers have been given. Most common answers given, by the way, are an elephant and a hippopotamus. And I have problems with both of those explanations. And here's the reason I have problems with both those explanations. Number one is the fact neither one of them have a tail like cedar. Now an elephant has a trunk that's pretty powerful, but if you look at the tail of an elephant, what? It's not really like cedar. To catch. It has terrible teeth in verse 14. Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? There are rows of scales. One reason that it seems that some have identified it as some whale, but whales don't have scales. And so they're shut up tightly with a seal. When it sneezes, in verse 18, this is interesting, what does it do? Flashes forth light. Out of his mouth go burning light. Some have identified it sort of like a dragon of some sort. A dinosaur-like dragon that had smoke or fire that may have come out of its mouth. Could God do that, by the way? Could God create a creature like that? Certainly could. Has a strong neck in verse 22. Man is afraid of him. And when he raises himself up, even the mighty get afraid of him. It's an aquatic animal, it seems, of some sort, but the sword can't defeat it in verse 26. The spear, the dart, the javelin can't conquer it. When he makes the deep boil like water and makes the sea like a pot of ointment. In fact, when he goes through the water, he leaves a wake behind him. Did you ever seen like a boat when it goes through and you can tell when it goes through the water, the wake is the waves and everything behind. This animal is of such size and power that when it goes through the water, what? It leaves a wake behind it. What is this animal? I'm like it, much like I am the behemoth. I have to first say I don't know positively, but I think it is likely some extinct sea creature, maybe a dinosaur, aquatic dinosaur of some sort. The point is you really don't have to identify specifically what these things are to appreciate the Lord's response. The point that he's making to Job is what? You see those creatures that you can't control and you can't capture and that man is afraid of what? I made them and I control them. That's the point. So I don't have to say, okay, here is the Tyrannosaurus, whatever it is, to identify that this is some powerful animal, and the point is, Job, you can't even capture it, but I made it, and I control it. And with that, God sort of ends his speech. And we come to chapter 42 now. And Job answered and said, I know you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. I know you're all powerful. I know that. And I know no purpose of yours can be withheld from me. I know in other words, when you want to do something, what? You're going to do it. You're the one that's in control. And that's the point. Really, if you had to sum up, what is Job supposed to learn from the speech of both speeches of the Lord? Number one, he needs to learn who's in control of everything. God is. He's all powerful. God is in control. He learns about the complexity of creation, which sometimes needs both good and evil. And you see that in the animal creature. And finally, Job, you were wrong. What? To question me. You were wrong to call my character into question. You are wrong, Job, to say that I don't know what I'm doing. In fact, I know more than you do. In fact, in comparison to me, you're pretty insignificant. That's the point. So you ask in verse 3, sort of like Job says, Lord, you asked earlier, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? I uttered what I did not understand. God, you're right. What is he saying? I shouldn't have questioned you. In fact, I was whittling on your end of the stick, I think is what he was saying. I was talking about things what? I don't understand. And I don't know. Things too wonderful for me. Listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will answer you, and you shall answer me. I have heard of you by the hearing of an ear, and now my eye sees. I think what Job is saying to him is, I knew about it. And here's the point, I think, that Job is making. If you had gone up to Job at any point in time during this entire episode, certainly before it began, you'd ask Job, Job, do you think God's all-powerful? What would Job have said? Yeah, sure he is. You think God's all wise? Yes, God's all wise. You think God knows what? Yeah, I know. God knows what he's doing. He had heard it with his ears, but now Job says what? I've seen it. I understand it now. Sometimes we accept facts, but we don't really what? We haven't really seen it sort of play out. Job said, I now have seen it, therefore I abhor myself. I don't think Job is saying, I hate Job. I just hate myself now. I don't think that's what he's saying, but I'm not sure that's an attitude God would approve of. I think what he's saying here is I hate what I have done. In fact, the footnote in the American Standard Version says, I loathe my words. You ever said something and then you think, I wish I could take that back. I hate that I said that. Job is saying, now that I have seen all of it and you've spoken to me, I loathe everything that I have said. I didn't mean it. I spoke what I didn't understand. Therefore, I repent in dust and ashes. Now, Job said, I'm going to change. I'm not going to do that anymore. Let me ask you a question. Did Job understand any better at the end of verse 6 than he did in chapter 3 why all this had happened? No. He didn't. What he had learned to do is to appreciate God's power and to put his faith in the Lord that, you know what? I know that you know what? What you're doing. And I think that's the power of the book of Job for you and me. Listen, why do things happen in my life sometimes? Why do we go through trials and tribulations? I don't always know. I think we've all been there. And I think we've probably all been there, whether it's a sick child, a sick grandchild, or something else, and we wonder, why, what? Why is this happening? And the reality is, a lot of times we don't know an answer. Sometimes it may be the natural order of things. Sometimes it may be the chastening of the Lord. But I tell you what I do know. Is God's in control of things. God's got it. And I'm not one to question the Lord. I'm not one to say, Lord, you just don't know what you're doing. It should have been done differently. No, God says what? I'm in control, trust me. And it's not a blind trust, but it's a trust that's based on his power in creation. It's based on his rule in this world. And Job understood that. I repent. I'm sorry. I said those things. I am going to what? I'm going to change. And I think ultimately, if there is a lesson that you learn from the book of Job, and again, I think the first time we're reading through it and studying, we're almost disappointed when we get to the end because we want some hard, concrete answer to why man suffers. But the point of the book of Job is not to give a definitive answer about that, but is to say, you trust me even when you don't understand, when you don't have all of the answers. Sometimes we don't even have all the answers. Sometimes we don't even know all the questions. But God says what? I'm still in control. Trust me, I know more than you do. And I tell you what you find as long as you live, is many times things we begin to question, the Lord really did know what he was doing. And things ultimately, sometimes we come out stronger and better even in the end. But even when I don't understand at the end of it, I can still trust in the Lord because I don't know what tomorrow may bring, but I do know who holds tomorrow. That's the point he's making with Job. Well, then after he makes that speech to Job, after Job responds by repenting, In 42 through verse 7, we have the sort of what we call the epilogue, and it's God's verdict. Some of it's almost funny if it wasn't so serious. When God calls the three friends together, and he says, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is against you and your two friends. I don't know how often God may have communicated to Eliphaz directly or not. This is in the patriarchal days, and God did do that from time to time. But I can't imagine the voice of God coming from heaven saying, Eliphaz, I'm mad at you. I mean, can you imagine what that must have done to Eliphaz? In fact, I'm mad at you and your two friends, my wrath. And listen, highlight this. For you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. By the way, look at this in verse 7. I think I've got them all here. I want you to notice as he talks to Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Look, my servant Job in verse 7. Now therefore take for yourself 7 bulls. My servant Job in verse 8. My servant Job in verse 8 again. My servant Job in verse 8 again. And then he said in verse 9, I have accepted Job. And so there's at least 5 times in talking to these friends who all along have been telling Job what? You're a sinner. You got to change. God very clearly said, he's my servant, my servant, my servant, my servant, my servant. And so he makes it clear to them, you know what? You're wrong about Job. But he said concerning them, I'm going to punish you, or I'm mad at you because you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job had done. Think about that last phrase with me for a minute. Didn't he just get on to Job for what Job had said? So in what ways was it that Job had spoken what was right about God? Well, in declaring what? He hadn't sinned. He was right, first of all, in saying, I'm innocent. I haven't done anything to deserve this. They're saying what? Repent. Job said, I haven't done anything. They were wrong. He was right. He also was right in the fact that even though he's called God into question, he had made the point that, you know what? Sometimes the wicked prosper. You and all, we know it. Sometimes righteous people suffer. Some of the things that Job had said was right, whereas the friends were almost completely and totally wrong in everything that they said. So, what do you need to do? Get yourself 7 bulls and 7 rams. Go to my servant Job, there it is again, and offer a burnt offering. And then think about this, and my servant Job will pray for you. I mean, here are these men that have been telling Job, you're just about as bad as they come. And God speaks and he says, you need to offer a sacrifice. And then Job, he'll pray for you, for me to forgive you. For I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly. In other words, if he intercedes for you, I'll listen to him, because you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has done. Listen, we're sometimes harsh on these 3 friends. I've said from the very beginning that I think they are good men that are mistaken about some things. I want to tell you, verse 9 to me tells me something about their goodness and their godliness, I think, deep down. And that is, God says you offer a sacrifice, you make things right. Look at verse 9, what happened? They went and did as the Lord commanded. In other words, God said, here's what you need to do. And what did they do? They did it. They did it. For the Lord had accepted Job. In other words, Job has been restored back. You know, Job had said, I'm going to be vindicated. Before all this is over with, he told his friends, I'm going to be vindicated. God's going to show you. Guess what happens? He's been vindicated. He's been vindicated, and he's proven that the things that the friends have said were not true. No, I do find it interesting that, and again, Elihu of the 3 friends, I think, is the one that is closest to the truth, and I don't think his accusations were quite as harsh, but I do find it interesting that he's not called out there as one that was called on to repent, and that God said, my wrath is kindled against you. Then in 10 through the end of the chapter, what happens? All his blessings are restored. All his brothers and his sisters and all those who had been his acquaintances before came to him. I've got this question written out in the margin of my Bible, and I don't know that I know the answer to this, but where had they been all along? You ever thought about that? Here all of his brothers and his sisters and everybody, they show back up, and now that the blessings have been restored, where had they been all along? I don't know the answer to that question. It may be that they had bought into the line of the 3 friends, and they thought Job was so sinful, Job was so wicked, we just need to what? We just need to stay away from him because of that, lest he influence us. That may have been. I tell you, sometimes it could be. Sometimes there are people that are sort of fair weather friends, you know. Have you ever known somebody that can show up at a party, but they can't show up when you know, in the time of need? Maybe they're that kind of, I don't know. But I've always wondered the question, a good answer to the question, I don't have it, where had they been when Job was going through all of this difficulty and the struggles that he'd been going through? The three friends were there, but they are not mentioned. But they did come back, and they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. So they're there to comfort him now that what? Now that it's all over. Each one gave him a piece of silver and a ring of gold. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, that's twice what he had before, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and it gives the name of the children in 14. His daughters were more beautiful than any of the other women around. Their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. He had enough. He gave them an inheritance just like the brothers had, and he lived 140 years and was blessed to see his children and his grandchildren for 4 generations. And so Job died old and full of days. And I take that to mean not only was he old, but he had lived a good, long, full life. In other words, things got better. Well, that's the book of Job. We got 5 minutes left. Tell me, we go through the book of Job. Very seldom do we take that book and go beginning to end, do we? And study through it. What stands out in your mind in the book of Job? What do you learn that can help you and I? What's the big lessons you learn from it? Yeah. And that's, you know, it's easy when we have blessings to accept that, but it's a little bit harder in Job's situation. But, you know, the book of Ecclesiastes, which we're fixing to get into, said in the day of prosperity, rejoice. Because you know what? God gave it to us, and it may not last. You might as well enjoy it while you've got it. In the day of adversity, what? Consider. What can I learn from this? How can I use it to make me better? For God appointed one as well as the other. What else do you learn in the book of Job that sort of stands out to you?
Job's faith is a way to simplify it because, you know, throughout the whole dialogue portion of the book, you know, the friends say, well, you've done something wrong to be treated this way. And Job says, no, I haven't.
Yeah.
He could have bent to their aggression, if you will, and agreed with them and
Yeah.
go on with what they said.
Right. Yeah. And that does speak to his faith. I mean, sometimes I'll read, you know, a crime story or something, or there's somebody that, you know, after, you know, 10 hours or 15 hours of interrogation, they'll finally go ahead and just say, what? I did it. You know, and then they find out they didn't. But sometimes, you know, when somebody's just continually what? Bombarding you with, you've done this, you've done this, you've done this. Sometimes the easiest course just becomes to say what? All right, I'm sorry, I repent. You know, but Job doesn't do that. He does maintain his integrity. I think one of the reasons for that is this. Who was ultimately Job concerned about? It was about his relationship with God. You know, and he wasn't so much concerned about how they viewed him as he was how God saw him, and he just couldn't understand why God would allow him to go through those things. I think we learned that human suffering does not allow for meaningful, our suffering does not allow for meaningful human analysis. And what I mean by that, you know, sometimes, again, we get to whittling on God's end of the stick. Let me tell you why you're going through this. I don't always know. I don't always know why I'm going through something. Job never knew, and I don't have to know to benefit from it and to learn the lessons of the book of Job. I learned to be careful making assumptions for which there are no proof. I think that's part of the frailty of these three friends is they make an assumption that they don't have proof for. And then they start making up proof for it. In essence, you know, well, you're a sinner. Well, tell me what I've done. I don't know what you've done, but you're a sinner. And then, well, you're rich. Since you're rich, you must have been dishonest. And since, you know, God took it away from you, you must have been gay. So they create evidence that is not really evidence at all. Sometimes we make assumptions that aren't true. You ever done that? Ever seen somebody make that? They'll see something and they'll make an assumption. And then they run with it. So be careful in doing that. I learned sometimes good and godly men believe godly principles, but they misapply them. I think that's the case. I've been in classes before, and I remember the first time I went through the book of Job, I really got to thinking, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they're just bad people. The more I've studied the book of Job, the more I've come to they're not bad people. I mean, they sat with Job for 7 days. That's a good friend. They were there. I mean, again, I go back to the end of chapter 42. Where was the sisters and the brothers and all them? They weren't there, but I tell you who was there. Was Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They were friends that were available. They were there. They cared. I think every bit of instruction they gave was probably given out of what? Love for Job and wanting him to make things right. But the problem is while they held to a biblical principle, you reap what you sow, they misapplied it in Job's case, and they applied it to the temporal instead of the eternal. And so I learned, be careful that you make the correct application of your biblical principles, and you don't misuse them to prove a point that you're trying to uphold. I learned in Job you can get through anything. You ever known anybody suffer quite like Job? I know everybody's suffering is difficult when they go through it. I'm not minimizing anybody's suffering. You ever known anybody suffer like Job? No. And yet Job got through. Indeed, you've heard of the perseverance or the patience of Job, and you've seen the end intended by him. You know why James said that? He said, just keep on keeping on, you'll be rewarded.
We all, sometimes we struggle, go through things that can cause our faith to leave us.
Right.
Or become weak, or even see people.
Sure.